Hi everybody. Today I'm working on a 2007 Mini Cooper S. Today I'll be replacing the clutch. You know you need to replace the clutch if it starts slipping, especially in higher gears going uphill at lower RPMs. I'll put a link in the description where you can get the parts. We'll be replacing the clutch disc, throwout bearing, pressure plate bolts. You should always replace these, and the dual mass flywheel with replacement bolts as well. You should always replace the dual mass flywheel at the same time, especially if it's making a chattering noise. You don't want to have to go back in there when it starts making a noise after you replace the disc. The chattering noise is because there's springs and the flywheel is made out of two separate pieces. Be sure to look up the correct part for your car, as the flywheel and clutch disc size changed over the years. To do this job, we're going to need to put the car in the air and remove the subframe and the exhaust to get the subframe out. It's technically possible to get the subframe out without removing the front bumper. So first thing we need to do is get the car up in the air. In order to get the subframe out, we have to remove this 13mm bolt that's attaching the steering column to the power steering rack. We'll take the bolt out and then push the arm off of the steering rack. Pop the hood. We're going to be disconnecting the ECU, so we'll disconnect the battery. There's a few bell housing bolts that we need to take off, and also the shifter cables and the reverse switch wiring from the top here. We're also going to need to remove this upper engine mount or transmission mount, and to do that I need to remove these parts here as well. So first I'll remove this intake tube. Just use a screwdriver to pop out this clip. This is an N14 car, but it's going to be very similar for an N18. The only difference is some of the wiring and intake path here is going to be a little bit different. Basically, we just disconnect the wiring and the hose clamps and it'll come right out. If I have a choice when disconnecting a hose clamp, whether I disconnect where rubber contacts metal or rubber contacts plastic, I'll choose the plastic interface every time. When rubber touches metal, it tends to kind of glue itself on there, but for plastic, it comes off much easier. So we'll just kind of wiggle this out of here. I'm going to remove this brake booster vacuum line because it's in the way. You just pinch and disconnect. This is not supposed to pop out like this. This was not installed correctly. But normally what you'll do is use a screwdriver here and kind of bend the plastic to pop the tube out. And we'll do the same thing up front. This one, it looks like it's broken and it popped right out, but it's the same idea. You have to just pry it with the screwdriver and pop it out. And we'll kind of twist and turn to get this tube out easily. 10mm bolt to get this off. There's another one here. One on the back. It helps to have a long extension to reach them. And then one more in the front, although in this car it's missing. And there's one more 10mm holding the ECU bracket down on the bottom here behind the AC line. We'll take off the box here. On this car the clips are broken. Then you can use the tip of a screwdriver to pop the retaining clips for the ECU. Just push down and fold forward. On some cars there's also a connection here as well. You just pinch and pull the two halves apart. There's a couple of harnesses attached to the box. I typically use a side cutter to cut off the zip tie, and then we'll replace later. There's another clip on the front here, and then also the reverse clip is on the bottom of the box. Then we can lift the bracket up and out. Hopefully we don't drop our screws. So that gives us really good visibility into the work area. So we're going to need to remove these shift cables. Down here is the reverse switch. All right, it's just getting started on the job and I had a camera failure. So it's one day later now and we've got a new camera. So we'll go ahead and continue the job. Okay, so yeah, we had just finished up where I was disconnecting the ECU and the reverse switch. So basically on the top here, there's going to be 3 bolts. Those bolts go here. The 13mm bolt goes right here through to the starter motor, and then there's those two larger bolts are the bell housing bolt. One goes here, and the other one goes up under here under the thermostat. I like to use a long extension. Sometimes a little bit of a swivel extension helps to give you a little bit of an angle because it gets in the way of the shifter cables here. So the other thing you have to disconnect on the top is the reverse line right under here. You just push on this clip here and then pull backward while pushing. And then the last thing you need to disconnect on the top is, well, there's two things here. First, you're going to actually pull here to pull the slave sealant hydraulic line out of the bracket here. And then the last thing to do is to take off the shifter cables. So first is these E12 bolts. That's going to allow us to get the bracket out of the way. And then next we need to disconnect the shift link here where it attaches to the transmission right here. The easiest way to do this is to grab a box wrench and just shove it into the space here and then pop it off just like that. The other one is a little bit hard to access. The easiest way to do it is probably to come from the front. So I like to get this coolant reservoir out of the way, same as any oil job. And I'll put one wrench under here, and then I'll put another wrench on top of it, and then pry upward just like that, and that pops it off. And then you can raise up this arm and put it out of the way. So that's pretty much it for the top for now. Later on we're going to need to remove this transmission mount, but for now we'll put the car up in the air and we'll go underneath and get the subframe and the axles out. So first we'll remove the front wheels. Next we have an 18mm bolt here for the tie rod end, and underneath there's two 21mm bolts. After removing the bolt, I'm going to pound on the place where the tie rod end goes through. Be sure not to hit the threads. We'll repeat on the other side. For cars with xenon headlights, you're going to need to also disconnect this little arm that adjusts the headlight height. There's two 10mm bolts, one here, one here. On the back side of the subframe arm, you're going to find that the wiring is held in by a Christmas tree type harness thingy. So you're going to want to pull that out. Next, we're going to disconnect the lower bolts on the sway bar end link. And we're going to use a needle nose vice grip. And then we can spin the bolt off. This is a 16mm. You're going to have to tighten the vice grip down pretty tight. Repeat on the other side. All right, underneath the car, we're going to have to disconnect several things. First is going to be the exhaust. We actually have to push the exhaust back out of the car. We're going to disconnect the engine mount here. We're going to remove this panel here. After we take the subframe out, then we're also going to drain the transmission oil, and we're going to remove the axle shafts. For the exhaust flange clamp, I like to knock it off with a 16mm deep drive, and then I use a pair of snap ring pliers to spread the clamp out. But first we have to get this bolt out, and sometimes it's a little tight. So what I'll typically do is put the nut back on and then swing at it a couple of times with the dead blow hammer. If it rotates around like what seems to have happened on this car, we can get in there and pry it back the other direction. What we're trying to do is push this bolt back through that direction, and it doesn't always like to do it. This one's being a little stubborn. I'll spray some penetrating oil to help it out. There we go. And then I'll take the snap ring pliers and just squeeze and push the clamp back onto the downpipe. There we go. All right, next we have to turn our attention to the rest of the exhaust. So there's going to be a total of 4 rubber exhaust hangers like this. And then there's going to be 6 10mm bolts holding the centerpiece here. And then once we have those taken out, we're going to push the exhaust back. I used an exhaust hanger remover tool. I'll put a link in the description for all the tools I use. But you can also just use a pair of channel lock pliers if you don't have something fancy like this. And if you don't have channel lock pliers, then, well, I don't know. You probably need a lot more tools than I can comment on. So I'll spray a little bit of a lubricant on the rubber part here to help it to slide out more easily. Then I'll grab a 10mm bolt remover and run out these 10mm bolts. So next I'm going to grab something to support the exhaust. This is a nice pole jack, but if you're working on the ground, you can probably just go ahead and let it flop down on the ground and drag it out. And then I'm going to go ahead and press out these exhaust hangers. Alright, so now the exhaust is free, only being held up by my pole jack. So I'm just going to lower it down. I've chosen a spot that's close to the center of gravity. And I'm just going to slide it backward about 2 or 3 feet. Yeah, I just needed to clear the subframe, so as you can see it's clear now. I'm going to remove this skid plate or belt protector. Phillips head fasteners here. Don't forget to remove the body clips. Also, don't forget to pull out the wire here that goes to the air conditioner. I'm going to go ahead and just unplug it, get it out of the way because it likes to hang up on the tube. So we'll run out these 13 mil bolts. Then we'll remove these two 16 mil bolts, and then we're going to push the intermediate arm back onto the subframe tube so we can allow it to clear the bottom of the bumper here. I'll use the edge of one of these bolts to push these intermediate bars as far back as possible. Okay, at this point I think the subframe is just being held in by, on each side, 3 bolts on the back here, 1 in the middle on the control arm, and then 1 up here where it goes into the upper crash tube. I'm going to remove all of these rear bolts and just leave the 2 front ones, and those are going to be the only bolts holding in the subframe until we bring in something to support it. I've got this fancy jack table, but you can use a floor jack. It's going to wobble around a lot though, so again, if you're using a floor jack, I would recommend having a buddy to help. Oh, I forgot to disconnect these bolts. These are 16 as well. All right, the weight of the subframe is on the table, and that's going to allow me to remove the last 2 bolts. And now I can slowly lower the subframe. And as I'm doing this, I'm going to push it backward as far as possible to clear the front bumper. So you got to fight it just a little bit to push back far enough, but if you do it right, it'll clear the bumper. You have to be a little careful on the right side of the car because the arm is going to be on top of the air conditioner feed tube here. So you're going to want to kind of push the tube in and pull the subframe towards the right side of the car. There we go. I'm going to go ahead and yank it out of there. So there's the subframe. If you're thinking about doing control arm bushings, now would be the time. I'm going to need to use this transmission table again to get the transmission out, so I'm going to lift up the subframe out of the way. I think that's out of the way. That'll work. Alright, so now we have really good access under here to finish the rest of the disassembly. First thing we're going to do is drain the transmission fluid. So I have a container and a funnel ready. This is an M8. I've got a funnel where I put like a strainer in it, so if and when the bolt drops in here, it's not going to block the flow off and make a giant mess. So we'll go ahead and spin this off. If the fluid is clean and mostly clear, it's totally fine to put it back in again. And yeah, this fluid looks totally clean, so I'm going to go ahead and just put it right back in. Redline MTL is a good replacement fluid. I'll put a link in the description. And that's going to take a while to drain, so we'll let that sit for a few minutes and turn our attention to the axle carrier bracket here. On this car, they're 13 mil. On some cars, they're Torx 45. Once you've got those bolts out, you can just pull this right side axle out. And then I'm going to swing it around and plop it up out of the way. I don't want that to fall, so I'm going to put a bungee cord around it to keep it up and out of the way. On the left side of the car, we're going to have to pop the axle out. It's only being held in by a circlip, so we're going to get in here and pry. And you're just basically going to pry on the strong part of the case and strong part of the axle, and pry swiftly, and it should pop out. So let's give it a shot. There we go. So I'm going to pull out and then swing this one around in the same fashion. I'm going to tie this one out of the way as well, because it likes to come back and get in the way. And while the fluid is still draining, we'll disconnect the slave cylinder as well for the clutch. And then I'm going to take this slave cylinder and also push it up out of the way. Okay, it's mostly done dripping, so I'm going to put the plug back in. I'll put the fluid someplace where I'm not going to knock it over. So all we have left now are bell housing bolts and starter motor bolts. But one of the bolts is hidden behind up here, the auxiliary water pump for the turbo. So there's two 8mm bolts we have to back out. We don't have to remove them completely, but we're going to have to back them up so that we can kind of flex this pump out of the way a little bit. So you're going to want a super short extension pretty much. You can see the first one fairly easily, and the next one is at the same height, a little bit farther back. These bolts are also easy to forget when it's time to put things together. So maybe, I don't know, tie a string around your finger or something. So I'm actually touching the bolt now with my finger. It's directly behind the pump. So I'm going to back out the bolt about halfway roughly. It's not a bolt that it's blocking, but the bell housing has to come around where the pump is. And it basically just is going to hit the pump if I don't. So if it's loose like this, then you're probably good. So next we'll remove all these bell housing bolts. And what I'm going to do is take all of them out except for this one right here. And I'll take this one out last after I have supported the weight. So these are all E12 or maybe E10 for the starter motor. Unfortunately, they're not in very tight. Yeah, it looks like on the earlier cars it's E10. On the later cars, these are E12. And you're going to want to be careful not to round out the E10 bolt on the top. That's probably why they switched to an E12. Because the one up top here on top of the starter motor, it's easy to bung it up. And also I hope you did disconnect the battery, because there's a good chance you're going to short, because the starter motor, the positive current line is right here. Looks like this one is slipping on me. It might have been rounded off by a previous job. Yeah, this has definitely been rounded over before by someone else, because even my box wrench is not going over. Of course, it's always the top one that strips out, which is the hardest access. Normally it comes out easy like this. Got it. Yeah, I don't know if you can see that, but the bolt head is kind of chewed up, and it was chewed up even before I got to it. Okay, so that allows me to pull the starter motor back and out of the way. And at this point, there are no more bolts holding the transmission in place other than this one on the bottom that I mentioned before. And again, if you're working on jack stands, which I suspect most of you are, you're gonna be able to get this transmission out with a floor jack if you want to. Using a transmission jack would be a little more stable. Or you can also go from the top and use a cherry picker or something like that. Once I get the last bolt out here and the upper mount for the transmission, the engine's gonna have nothing to support it. So you'll need one transmission jack, or pole jack in my case, to hold up the engine. What I'll do is I'll support the engine with my pole jack, and then I'll raise the engine up slightly, take the weight off of the transmission mount on this side, and then lower the engine down like this. Also, when you put your table or jack or whatever, this is the seam here between the engine and the transmission. This chunk here is actually part of the engine block. So you don't want to put your jack touching this part. So I'm going to bring in my pole jack here again. And I'm going to put it as far as I can to the center of the engine. I got a block of wood here with a notch here that clears the oil pan. Okay, so that'll allow me to raise up the engine without getting in the way of my transmission jack. I'll go ahead and raise the table up and let it just gently touch the bottom of the transmission. All right, and I'll go back up on top with a 13 mil socket and an 18 mil socket. First, I'm going to remove this big 18 mil main bolt. So now all of the weight is on the pole jack and the transmission jack. I'll continue by removing the top half of the mount here. And there's one more hiding behind the coolant reservoir. So I'm going to pull this out of the way. And then there's a bottom half of it here. I'm going to remove this as well, because otherwise when I lower the transmission out past the crash tube, it tends to get in the way. This is 13 mil as well. I'll just lift this up and get it out of the way. I'll remove this last bell housing bolt, and I'll push the transmission table up just so it gently contacts the transmission. And you'll see there's a gap that's formed here between the engine and the transmission, so I can just kind of gently pry it backward. And then I'm going to lower the transmission table a little bit and keep prying. Kind of give it a little wiggle. I'm going to go around the back side and do the same thing. Okay, so you can see it's mostly off of the engine. The input shaft is still hanging on the clutch disc, and I've got a bit of an angle going here, so I'm going to have to lower the engine here with the pole jack. So you can see that the top of the transmission is starting to clear the crash tube here, and unfortunately it looks like I bottomed out my pole jack. My block of wood is a little bit too big. So let me see if I can figure out what to do about that. I'm going to jack the whole thing up again with the transmission jack. Swap out the wood for something that's a little shorter because I need the engine to come down a little more. Yeah, I'm just going to split this block of wood. There we go. Throw it back in here. And we'll resume lowering the table. There we go. If I look through the bell housing here, I can see that the input shaft is completely off of the clutch disc now, so I can lower it the rest of the way out. So as you can see, you basically need the car to be up high enough that you can drop the transmission out from under the car. All right, I'm going to slide it right out of here. Seeing a bit of oil in here. I think we might have a rear main seal leak. First, we're going to take off this throwout bearing. You just kind of pull it off. The arm came off too. This piece here is supposed to stay in there. Let's take this off. You just kind of push this little spring here, and then we can take it out. This piece, generally speaking, doesn't need to be replaced if it's in good condition. So I'll put this back on. You just slide it over the end here, push the spring in place, and then you're going to snap it back on. But we're going to grease everything up as well. These are Torx E10, and just like the bolts are holding in the starter motor, you want to make sure your tool doesn't strip these because they're easy to strip. So here's that dual mass flywheel. You can see when I turn it, this half of the flywheel turns separately from the inside, and you can hear it's making noise even when I'm turning by hand. So that's the noise you hear on a cold morning when you start it up. Sometimes it's called the Chewbacca sound. So you always want to replace the flywheel. The flywheel bolts are Torx T55. Just a few signs of oil here. Oh, there we go. So you can see it's a little bit wet here. We were planning on doing that, so I do have a seal and I will be replacing this. As far as removing, you can just take a screwdriver, put it in, and then very gently you can pry the old seal out. You want to be very careful not to damage the edge of the crank here, especially the flat round part. So pry very gently and carefully. Here's the seal, and you'll see that the new seal has a special plastic flange here that assists in reinstallation. We're going to want to lubricate this as well, this lip here, as we install it. Make sure you've lubricated everything. Once you've lubricated it, you can reinstall it onto the install tool. And then we're going to slide the tool over the crank. Then we can push the seal back on over the tool here. And once it's hard to push by hand, we can drift it in the rest of the way, a little bit at a time, with this block of wood and a hammer. Don't tap too hard. Go around, all around the circle, and just tap a little bit at a time. If it starts to pop out on one side, tap it in on the other side. Once you've cleared the crankshaft snout here, we can take out the plastic supporting tool and finish pounding it in. And then finally we can drift it all the way down until the edge of the tool is flush with the edge of the bell housing here, or the engine. And when complete, you're going to want to feel all the way around and make sure it's even all the way around. You don't want the seal at a funny angle. So it feels a little bit high over here, so I'm going to drift that in just a little bit more by putting my block of wood at a slight angle here. All right, that feels good to me. We'll hit this with some brake cleaner to clean up the mess. I'm also going to clean and wipe down the pressure plate. Not necessary to clean the clutch. I'll clean the flywheel as well later on. And then in the clutch box, there's usually a packet of grease, and you're going to want to put the grease on the moving parts. So I'll put some grease here on the output shaft seal, or the output shaft guide tube. I'll put a little bit of grease on the pivot point here. I'll put some grease right here. Then we can install the throwout bearing onto the arm. And then I'll slide the arm over the guide tube, and then I'll push it over, and that's good to go. The last place I'm going to put the grease is on the input shaft. If you don't put grease here, the clutch disc can hang up, make it hard to install, and I'll just wipe off the extra so there's not too much. All right, we'll go back under the car again, and don't forget to reinsert the crank position thingy, lining it up with the dowel here on the bottom. Then we're going to grab the flywheel. On the front, you can't tell which way is which, but on the back there's going to be one extra hole here, right here. There we go. Don't ask me what the torque value for this is. I forget. I've done so many of these. I know how tight it needs to be. All right, so the flywheel's in. Okay, this kit did not come with an alignment tool. Fortunately, I've got a few spares to choose from. Basically, next we want to make sure that we put gearbox side facing towards the gearbox. Oh, yeah, and if you don't have an alignment tool, let me show you the trick for how to install that. Let's pretend I don't have an alignment tool. You can just center the disc onto the pressure plate, and you can see, if you look all the way around, you can see that it's centered. There's 3 different spots where you can look through where the springs are, and you just want to make sure that this distance here is the same on all 3. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not like we're installing a BMW self-aligning clutch or anything like that. Basically, you just need to make sure the input shaft can catch the disc and pull the transmission all the way onto the engine. But again, make sure you've got gearbox side facing out. So I'm just going to stick my finger through the middle here, pretending like I don't have the tool. And then make sure you line up the bolt holes in the dowels like this. Kind of wiggle it until it slaps together, and then you can put in a couple of the bolts. And then now we're going to eyeball up through the gap here. And you can move the clutch with your finger here, see? And you can line it up until it's kind of centered. And then you can look around and sight your way through the other ones, the other holes, or you can just feel it actually. So that's the same as that. That's the same as that. Once you got it where you like it, just zip down couple of the screws to hold it in place, and then come back again and make sure it didn't move. If you like it, then you can zip down all the bolts. There's no pilot bearing like on some cars, so even this tool really doesn't center it completely. It just helps you to kind of eyeball it. One thing though is you want to make sure you pull this out before you tighten the bolts down, because these pressure springs will go downward and it could make the tool captive, so you want to take that out first. All right, that should be good. Okay, so now we can bring the transmission and start putting it back. I'm also going to push it to the front of the table here so I don't hit the engine. And again, this is a part where if you've got someone to help you, you're really going to want it because it's pretty heavy. It's nice to have a couple people to help to push it on. And I would suggest always having one of the bell housing bolts in your hand, so when you do line it up, you can get a bolt started real quick before it falls back out. And I'll start raising it back up. So as we're putting it back in, you're gonna just want to make sure that the surfaces here are parallel in the X and Y orientations. That's going to be really important, or the shafts will never go in. And also, you're going to want to give it a little bit of a wiggle back and forth so that the teeth line up. This can be time consuming, but if you think about those things, it can make it go a little easier. It's a good idea to go up on top every once in a while as well to make sure nothing's caught on anything. I'm gonna go around to the back here and kind of manhandle it a little bit. Yeah, it looks like it came a little closer, but now the top is too close, so I'm gonna raise the engine up. Okay, we're getting close. There we go. Looks like it went a little more. There we go. So this, you can see the shaft is completely on now. Looks like the bolts aren't quite lined up, so I need to rotate it up a little bit. There we go. Got the first bolt started. So I'll go through and put a couple more in, and then I'll gently pull the two halves together. Put another bolt in. Obviously, make sure there's nothing stuck in between the two sides. Okay. A couple bolts are going to be enough to hold everything together. So now we're going to go ahead and raise the whole drivetrain back up to the installed position. Now we can go back on top here and reinstall the mount. And then we can put the top half of the mount back in. I'm going to go ahead and start all the bolts by hand first, of course. Be sure not to pinch any wires and cause a fire. And then last, we'll put the big 18mm bolt. Okay, so the weight is now all held by the mount. All right then, obviously the job is not done, but that's pretty much all there is to it as far as taking things apart and the hard stuff for getting the stuff back in. The rest of the job is assemble in reverse order. Just be careful when you put the subframe back in. Start from the back and kind of tilt it up and in so that you can clear the bumper. I'll put a link in the description with parts and tools for this job. Thanks for watching, and bye-bye.